when The Simpsons first aired, it was seen as radical. And, I think George Bush had this famous quote that we need more families like the Waltons and less families like the Simpsons. I mean, it was at the forefront of being edgy.
What good is a university degree these days? Well, just ask Joel Cohen, who graduated from the University of Alberta and then got an MBA from York. He's now the associate producers of The Simpsons. And when he's not coming up with gags for Homer and the crew, the Emmy Award-winning writer is giving talks to groups like, wait for it, the Canadian Nuclear Association.
You've been asked about this hundreds of times, I'm sure, but it's worth commenting on that you have...
How do I get my hair so silky?
Well, there's that.
Yeah.
It must be conditioner, I'm thinking.
I'd rather not divulge it.
Okay.
Actually. Yeah.
You have a BSc, a Bachelor of Science from University of Alberta.
Correct.
And an MBA from York.
Correct.
And yet neither of those degrees has done you any good.
Which I proudly...
I was going to say, what kind of an example to the kids are you?
Maybe a good one. I don't know. It's just don't pay your student loans. Not much. I mean, who's to say they haven't? I work in a job where sometimes I need to know a little bit of biology or how to do a net present value. And there I have those tools if I need to. But I also work with a guy who went to Harvard Law School and a chemical engineer and a guy who has a PhD in computer science. So there's...
These guys are all writers like you.
All writers.
Right.
You could not imagine how much wasted education is in that room.
I was going to say.
Yeah.
And the amount of student loans, too, I'm thinking.
I would think. Maybe we're all not paying them off together. It's a Cayman Island colony.
So you did your MBA at York in Toronto, and,
yes.
and you spent, I gather you spent a fair amount of time in Toronto. You spent a few years there.
5 years.
And we're doing some writing kind of on the side, is that right?
A very little bit, just sort of dabbling, as much as you could do in the TV comedy world in Toronto at that time, which was not a lot.
So what was that dabbling? What sorts of things?
I wrote a pilot, which I think was going to be for YTV, and tried to get jobs on some other shows, but really it felt like there was only maybe 3 or 4 television comedies at the time, and I had an agent and everything, just had a very hard time actually getting any traction.
Yeah. Was that sort of a kind of debilitating thing? Did you just think, well, why am I even bothering?
Not so much. I mean, it sort of happened at the same time that I got this other job offer in Los Angeles, business job offer,
right.
which I used my MBA for. And so then when I moved to LA, obviously there's a lot more opportunity to actually pursue writing there. So it worked out sort of for
Well, I'm interested in that because we've talked to both Paul Haggis and David Steinberg, and both of them went to LA when they were in their early 20s. But they both went with this idea that, okay, they wanted to write, and that was the place they had to go. Whereas you went because you had another job offer.
Right.
That just happened to be the fertile writing ground.
It's true.
Yeah.
That's all true, yeah. It worked out very well, and then once I was there, I'm like, well, if I'm ever going to try writing, this is the place to try it, and luckily it's turned out for now.
The original gig in LA, though, was a sales job or something, wasn't it?
Yeah, I was working for Turner Broadcasting, selling advertising on their networks in Latin America and Asia and Europe.
Really?
Yes, really. Why would anyone lie about that? Who
no,
would make
that's
up
true.
That lie?
Who would want to lie about
exactly.
that? So these are the ads these are the products that they don't sell in North America that they pawn off on the third world?
Kind of. There's some very weird products, including one that I remember, I forget who was selling it, but it was a product that people were trying to sell in Africa that made your skin lighter. And I remember that would air on CNN in Africa. And I was, party to that, to getting that on the air. One of my proudest moments, really.
So you were selling. You weren't like writing copy or anything.
No, I was selling. I was definitely selling. Yeah.
Okay. So the writing thing, then, how did that come about? What was the?
My brother is also a writer.
Yes.
Of less note than me. I want that to make sure we get that on TV.
Okay.
But he was down there, and I just tried. Like everybody does, you write sample scripts. You try to get them to agents, and hopefully something clicks somewhere. I really had no success whatsoever. And then with my brother, he introduced me to Kathy Griffin.
Yeah.
And her and I became friends. I started writing some stuff for her, some jokes for award shows she was hosting, etc. And then she was on Suddenly Susan, and she sort of endorsed me enough that I got a job on Suddenly Susan. And then kind of once you're in the door, you're a little bit up and running.
Were you, at that point, how much material were you cranking out? Were you full of ideas that you wanted to get out, or were you struggling to come up with things when you met her and were writing for her, you're writing for a particular personality.
Right voice.
Yeah. What was that like?
Well, even before I met her, I mean, the way it kind of works is you have to write these sample scripts of existing shows that you try to show people because it shows that you can tap into the characters and pace of an existing show, pardon me. So I was doing that for shows like, at that time, Frasier and Friends and Just Shoot Me, etc. And then when I started writing for Kathy, you know, she obviously has a very distinctive voice. So I was writing for her, and a lot of times it was just like, I've written 40 jokes for you. Let me tell them all to you. And then she'd say, I like those 3. And then she'd use those 3. And, you know, that was the process that we did.
Okay.
And still do sometimes.
Okay. So tell me about Suddenly Susan, because that ran for, what, 4 years, did it not? 4 seasons?
Yeah, it did. I was only there for the very last year. Coincidence, I'm sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
You weren't there then when the writers had to deal with David Strickland's suicide, I'm assuming. Or were you?
I can't remember if I was there the year. That happened in the summer
Yeah.
on hiatus. And it's possible I came the fall right following.
Because they had to deal with that. I mean, he was a major, one of the main
it's
characters,
true,
right?
It's true. And I must be honest, I didn't really watch a lot of Suddenly Susan, even when I was working there. But
what?
I know, it's scandal. But I don't remember exactly. That was 11 years ago, and I tried to block that out. But I don't remember exactly where the David Strickland tragedy fell within that.
Okay. The reason I asked was I was curious about how writers would deal with something like that when you lose one of the major actors under circumstances that the whole world, you know.
Right, totally.
Yeah. You know.
Well, also, again, there was a big turnover in the cast. Judd Nelson also left the cast,
Yeah.
and when I started, Eric Idle had come on, and they had brought a bunch of new characters on as well. I think trying to sort of reinvigorate the show. Sadly, they hired me, which de-invigorated the show. But
and it lasted one more season.
Barely squeaked out one more season, and then it was over. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Do you remember describe what the writing experience there was? Was it a collective writing thing? Did you each contribute individual scripts? How did it work?
It was very similar to The Simpsons.
Yeah.
Obviously, a little bit of a different tone, and it's live action versus animation,
Yeah.
so you're constrained a little bit by only writing scenes for 4 sets as opposed to Simpsons. You can write for anywhere.
Right.
But really great people and very smart, and a lot of people from that writing staff have gone on to great success on their own on other jobs.
Did this do a lot for your self-confidence about your writing when you went through that experience?
Well, just getting a job was a miracle. So, pardon me, that really helped my self-confidence a lot, just that facet alone, getting a job. And then being in a room and actually seeing that I could contribute and participate definitely helped.
Yeah. Okay, I want to ask you about that then. You went to The Simpsons. And before I ask you about that writing experience and how that all works out for you and how it all plays out,
I'm curious myself.
How did you get? Well, I guess you are. How did you actually get that gig? How did it come about?
The Simpsons?
Because your brother had been writing there before, right?
My brother had written 1 episode in season 2.
All right.
When I joined the show, it was season 12.
Yeah.
So roughly 10 years later.
So there was no cachet attached to
saying
the
that was my
Cohen
brother?
name at all.
No, and between he and I, the Cohen name is dead. Trust me. I pity further generations. But my boss, one of my bosses, a man and a woman, Maria Semple was the woman, a very good writer, and she was my boss at Suddenly Susan. Her then boyfriend and still boyfriend is a sort of legendary Simpsons writer, George Meyer. So I sort of met George a little bit, but I guess with Maria's endorsement through George and through some other people she knew at The Simpsons, it was a very easy transition. I was out of work for 13 days, which is a phenomenally short time.
Yeah.
And I just went there, and basically Mike Scully, the guy who hired me, just said, I've heard really good things from Maria and George, and we want to offer you a job. And I said, I'll take it.
Yeah, I would think.
Yeah.
You know, there have been 2 shows out there in the last little while, one that's still on the air, 30 Rock, and one that, in my opinion, sadly was canceled, which was Studio 60, which I thought was a great show. Both of which show writers' rooms, writers writing comedy.
Right.
And they're sort of depicted, at least on Studio 60 they were, sort of depicted as very competitive, Shark Tanky kind of situations. Is that what it's like?
Well, Studio 60 was often laughed at by writers because it was so unrealistic.
Oh, really?
I mean, I remember one episode of that show where Matthew Perry claims, I think he wrote the entire show except for one joke, and he just wanted, and of course that's not the truth at all. It's incredibly collaborative.
But that's Aaron Sorkin's world, isn't it?
That might be how Aaron Sorkin works, but that is not. That works in the comedy world.
Okay.
It's competitive in a sense, but it's also collaborative in the sense that no one's leaving until you get that joke or that story or that script done. So yes, you would like to be the person that saves the day, but if it's not you, you'll just be glad and thankful if anybody gets the joke that saves the day, because you're stuck there until you do. So at first it's like, yeah, I want it to be my joke, and then as you start looking at your watch, it's like, please, somebody just have any joke that gets us out of here. So, and especially at The Simpsons, we've all worked together for so long. it's more of, I would feel like a team aspect as opposed to competitive.
Does somebody write the spine of a script, and then it just sort of everybody contributes to fleshing that out? How does it work?
One writer will pitch an idea, which is at this point a very hard thing to do because we've had 450-ish episodes. So just to find an idea that gets approved to be a script is a challenge. But once you find that idea, the writer will write a first draft of the script, and based on an idea being approved, write a first draft, then bring that first draft back into the writer's room, and then it will be examined from top to bottom. And the story could change, certainly all the jokes could change, whatever it takes to make it better, and the entire room as a whole will go through the script line by line with notes from our boss and senior writers saying this has to change, this has to change, and we'll go through and do a new version of the script. That again will go through the same process, and really by the time a script is aired, it's probably gone through this gauntlet, I'm going to say 8 times.
Every show?
Every show. And we have a lot of writers, so we got to have them do something.
How many writers?
Can't just order lunch all the time.
Well,
we have about 17, 18 full-time and maybe 5 part-time.
Okay. You mentioned earlier when you were talking about how different it was writing for Suddenly Susan because you were writing for actors. And that's one of the things that's always intrigued me, because when you're writing stuff for actors and you change something, then they just have to memorize new pages.
Right.
But when you change stuff over and over again for something that's animated, I assume that the people responsible for the animation at some point start getting a little pissed at you because you're changing it all the time. I mean, what's that relationship like?
Well, I hope they don't get pissed, but what happens is we know, as much as they like to or hate to do the animation, it's also a function of time. So as we get closer and closer to the air date, we can only change so much, and we have to pick our spots. And one of the funniest or most challenging times of the show is we'll have a screening of an episode, we call it a color screening, a month before it's going to air. And there's really no time to reanimate something. So we are thinking about a joke that involves the same lip flaps as the current line. So we're like, okay, that was a 7-syllable joke. We need another 7-syllable joke. So you have all these Harvard-educated jerks and one guy from Canada sitting around counting syllables and then pitching things in the same syllable. Can we do a 6 one or an 8-syllable and try to jam it in there? And we do that a lot. And our actors are good enough that they can make it work.
But my God, I'm astonished by that, because that's even more of a restriction on the writing of jokes than just coming up with jokes.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that doesn't happen a lot, but
it's like writing a haiku.
It really is. You're stuck to this format. It doesn't happen a lot, but I'd say almost every episode, every other episode, there's something where we're like, we got to use this animation, but we don't like the line, or it doesn't benefit the story, or it bumps with the story. How can we reuse this animation and just change the audio?
Yeah. Okay. Now, the other thing, I guess the upside of this, too, would be, and you made a reference to this as well, that when you're writing for animation, you can place it anywhere. I mean, which has happened with The Simpsons.
Right, absolutely.
I mean, there is no time frame for The Simpsons. They are ageless.
Right, absolutely.
And episodes can take place wherever you want them to.
It's incredibly liberating. If you have a joke that involves cutting away to Paris for 1 second, write the joke, and we'll cut away to Paris, or space, or underwater, and it's amazing. Yeah, it's incredibly liberating to be able to do that. We tried that on Suddenly Susan, and we had budget problems.
I would think.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot's been said about how The Simpsons kind of opened the door for a number of shows like South Park and Family Guy and so on. Though it seems to me that The Simpsons has never pushed the boundaries of taste the way that, say, Family Guy or South Park has. And that probably explains, I would think, its longevity. Would you agree?
I think that's true. It's funny. When The Simpsons first aired, it was seen as radical.
Yeah.
And I think George Bush had this famous quote that we need more families like the Waltons and less families like the Simpsons. I mean, it was at the forefront of being edgy, whatever edgy means. And now, just partly because it's been on for so long, but also because acceptance of whatever edgy is has changed, that shows like Family Guy and South Park are pushing it even further. But The Simpsons still remains controversial, and there are I know families that won't let their kids watch it, and they're It certainly seems mild compared to those, but it's just a matter of it being around for so long.
But you have had problems with Fox standards and practices, guys, have you not?
We have humorous problems with them, yes, where they get upset. We had a famous, this is not so much of a censorship issue, but we had a show one time, an episode I actually wrote, where we had a store called Sprawl Mart, which was, let's be honest, a very thin parody of Walmart. But they were upset about that. They said this is too obviously a thin parody of Walmart. So we had to change the sign on the store. So when it finally aired, it said Sprawl Mart, And then underneath in fine print said, not a parody of Walmart. So that was enough to get by them. But that's not so much a censorship issue as an advertising issue. But
what about language issues and things like that? Have they ever come down on you for anything like that?
Yeah, we get notes on every script because trying to be funny sometimes is not being safe. We had an episode once where Marge said BFD, an acronym that maybe your viewers can figure out.
Yes.
And they bleeped the F. So just said B bleep D. So like the letter F was obscene in their minds for some reason.
So it could have been underwear for all anybody knew.
If underwear was spelled with an F.
Yeah. There you go.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. But that, in this day and age, that seems so picayune, it defies belief.
Somebody in standards and practices needs a job, and I'm happy to keep them employed if we can by writing letters that are obscene.
When the 20th anniversary show of The Simpsons ran, after it they ran this little documentary by Morgan Spurlock.
Absolutely.
And there was and in that, of course, I guess because somebody somewhere said, well, we have to have somebody complaining about this show. So they had the nuclear guys on whining about how they're represented in Springfield at the nuclear plant and stuff. Now, the day that we're shooting this, you're here in this very hotel speaking to the Canadian Nuclear Association. What's that all about?
I imagine this is a trick to get me here, and then they're all going to beat me up in unison. That's what I've seen a lot of guys with brass knuckles and blackjacks and stuff like that. Obviously they have a sense of humor about it to some extent. We're going to find out. This might be my last video recording. Family, I love you.
That's what I was going to
say. It's a personal message. The money is in the basement.
This will be running on Al Jazeera later today.
Exactly.
Okay.
I think they have a sense of humor about it. And the bulk of the talk is more just about The Simpsons and creativity and innovation and how we manage it all, The Simpsons. It so happens, of course, there's this connection between nuclear power and The Simpsons and the Canadian Nuclear
But you've managed this. This is actually quite a nice little side gig that you've got here, because you've done this quite a bit. You've gone around and talked about the Tao of Homer in a number of places to some prestigious groups.
Poorly received everywhere.
Yeah, I highly doubt that. I mean, people love this stuff, right?
I mean, everyone loves the show. I'm lucky enough to be affiliated with the show in some way, and this is a way for companies to kind of tap into the show. And if I can be a part of that, then
let me take you back to when you first started writing there, because and I've seen a couple of interviews with you where you've mentioned just in passing how you felt that first day. But all I could think of was, man, walking into a room with a bunch of writers who've been, probably most of them had been with the show from the beginning, so that would have been about 12 years at that point.
Several of them, yeah.
Yeah. So you're walking in there and you're expected to produce. You're expected to contribute.
Right.
I mean, that to me would be, a pardon me, testicle shriveling creativity killer. I mean, was it?
They still haven't come back to their full diameter. It's very intimidating. I've told the story before. At my first day, we was the screening, the color screening, so almost finished version of this episode called Behind the Laughter, which is one of my favorite episodes. And my very first day, I walked in, we screened the episode first thing, and I was like, that is one of the funniest, most polished, beautiful things I've ever seen in comedy. And then we go back to the writer's room and spend 35 minutes, everyone talking about what's wrong with it, and not only what's wrong with it, but how to even make it better. And that's sort of when it hit me, just like, I've seen this masterpiece, and then I've heard 15 artists talk about how to make it even better. It was incredibly intimidating, and honestly, I probably didn't talk or pitch a joke for the first 3 or 4 months on the show. I just sort of sat there and waited till lunch and waited to go home, and then finally, your confidence builds slowly, and now it's at the point where people tell me, stop pitching jokes. Those are not funny. They're not going in the show, etc. So.
Do you remember the first thing you got on the show?
I remember a joke in a show called, I think it's called The Blunder Years, where Homer pulls a prank on Marge and has to take her out for dinner. And somebody says, well, should I take her to dinner and a show? And I pitched the joke, why not take her to Benihana, where dinner is the show? And I believe that might have been the first joke.
Boom.
It was as funny then as it is right now.
See.
Yeah.
And Benihana for a Canadian audience doesn't mean...
No, it's like the Japanese village for people in Western Canada. I don't know about Eastern Canada, you're on your own. Figure it out. Yeah.
Okay.
Pick up a book.
All right.
Yeah.
So, okay. And then there was so you saw your contributions then. I mean, once that happened, was that sort of like the breaking of the dam? You then were...
a slow build to confidence. And also... after just a ton of rejection of pitching jokes that never go in the show, you somehow build up a thick skin or are unable to feel the pain of rejection anymore. And now it's just like, well, I'm just going to keep pitching. I might as well. And I know I'll go 1 for 40, but I don't know where that 1 is. So just here comes the 40. So just keep saying stuff, and hopefully they go in. And that's what everyone needs to do, and that's how the room works. It's just an avalanche of options, and one good one will arise.
And the tough part, I guess, now after 20 years, and I know you've been asked this too, but it's worth asking. After 20 years, you have to come up with new ideas all the time.
Yeah.
And you made a reference earlier, obliquely, to the fact that that's a tough thing to do now.
It wasn't that oblique.
But but you're also, the show has gotten self-referential as it's gone along too.
Absolutely.
So it's getting kind of Escher-like in its own, isn't it?
I mean, it is. I mean, it's impossible not to repeat ourselves because, as you said, we're stuck in this little slice of life where the kids are the same age, Homer's the same age, they live in the same house most of the time, and it's almost impossible to find, or 450 we found stories, but to find stories that are so unique, they've never been done before. We do, occasionally we don't, and we sort of find ourselves retreading ground, and if we are conscious of it enough, we'll make fun of ourselves. Yeah. And if we're also a little bit conscious of it, we'll try to change it a little bit so it's not exactly like what people have seen before. But it happens almost every day where somebody says, well, that's kind of like something we did in this episode, and that person's beaten up, and or that joke is like a joke we did in this show, and it just happens.
How could it
just
not?
Happens. It happens.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about the guest stars, the guest voices, because there have been a lot over the years. And I'm wondering, it probably started before you were at the show, I'm assuming. But
my brother wrote the Flaming Moe episode of season 2, and Aerosmith was
there.
You go.
Star. All right. So when that happens, when a writer, does a writer come up with the idea and say, how about this? Let's see if we can get Liz Taylor in there, or Michael Jackson, or whatever.
It's harder to get Michael Jackson now.
I would have thought it would have been easier myself, but there you go.
We'll see.
But when that happens, I guess you have to. You know what it takes to go through the levels of their peeps to actually get to them to get an okay on this. In the meantime, you guys are trying to create a show that has a deadline attached to it. How tricky can that get at times?
It's run the gamut from us, just Metallica as an example. We just like, hey, this would be funny to have a scene with Metallica here. So we just wrote it. And Metallica sent it to them. They said yes. That's the easiest version. Another easy version is that a lot of times celebrities will come to us and say, I really want to be on the show. Some of them we don't really want to have on the show, and others we're like, great, and we'll write stuff for them. From there it gets different levels of difficulty where celebrities will come to us and say, I want to be on the show. We'll write a big part for them. Then they'll realize we're making fun of them, and they'll say, I don't want to do this. You're making fun of me. And then
I want you to attach names to all these things, but you're not going to, are you?
I don't want to say John Bon Jovi. Okay. I don't want to say that.
All right.
So we've done various things, and there have been episodes where we have somebody and then they fall out and we try somebody else, and we'll go 4 or 5 iterations of trying to find a guest star. So everywhere runs the gamut, and we've had Mick Jagger, and we've had The Who, and we've had Tony Blair. We've had from the greatest stars to just a weird Nobel Prize winner just for an obscure joke. So it runs virtually a lot of yeses, a lot of nos, and a lot of everything in between.
Now, to flip that around, and this is something that just occurred to me a moment ago. My daughter is a huge fan of the television show Bones.
That just occurred to you?
And she pointed out to me, this story did.
You didn't know you had a daughter till now.
I did, actually.
Oh, okay.
I run across her occasionally.
Yeah.
But she pointed out that in an episode of Bones at one point, they were in their little forensic lab, and they walked past all these x-rays in the background, and one of them was an x-ray of Homer's head. And then during the show, there were these strange guys who kept coming in to get one of the bosses to sign these clipboards, and they were all guys from The Simpsons.
That was all in celebration of the 20th anniversary of the show, where every show on Fox, so the highest quality television program,
there you go,
would honor The Simpsons in some way. So for Bones, my boss, a gentleman named Al Jean, and then the two sort of second in commands, Matt Selman and Ian Maxtone Graham, they all served as extras in the lab, handing clipboards to, I don't know about to Bones, but to somebody. And there was, that same week on House, as their tribute to The Simpsons, a woman came in that had named her individual breast Patty and Selma after Marge's sister. So, again, this is Fox, so,
All right. Is Matt Groening at all still involved in this in any direct way?
Yeah, he is not there every day, and Futurama is now back in production, another show that he runs or is involved with, so he's juggles his time in between. He comes to all the table reads, he comes to all the screenings. Every now and then he'll pop his head in for an hour or so. Yeah. So he's definitely around.
Okay. Let me, in the last couple of minutes we've got here, let me just ask you about your writing.
Sure.
Having written for, Paul Haggis said to us that, he'd written for all these television shows in the 70s and 80s.
Right.
And the thing that got him, he claims that got him into directing serious films was waking up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat thinking that his tombstone was going to say the man who created Walker, Texas Ranger.
Right.
And that's why he got into serious films. But
but
he said he didn't really start knowing what good writing was, even though he'd been writing, until he was about 40. That there was kind of a watershed moment for him, which happened to be writing on 30-something with a group of very, very creative writers. For you, writing on this show and having basically created a template that goes on and on and on, do you worry sometimes that in your own professional writing career that you've kind of locked yourself into something that's going to be hard to shake if and when this thing ever comes to an end?
It's a good question. So congratulations to you.
Thank you very much.
You know, the question is, do I feel like I've been pigeonholed kind of as a Simpsons writer?
Yeah, kind of, yeah.
I would say perhaps a little bit, although that is a fur-lined pigeonhole that it wouldn't be the worst place to be pigeonholed as. And there are certainly cases of many of my colleagues that have gone on to write movies and be successful in other facets of television as well. So it's not as bad as that. It is still a show that is respected. If you tell someone you write on The Simpsons in the industry, it's very well respected that that's a show that has good writers and has good writing. So people respect that.
Do you have time to do any writing on your own outside of that to sort of keep yourself nimble?
You know, I do a little bit of stuff in feature films and a little bit of other stuff in television, but Simpsons is a full-time job, so it's, I'm worried my boss is going to see this. So, you know, that's where I focus most of my energy, and that's true of everybody. You know, we all occasionally will write a pilot or something for a network, but everyone does a little bit of stuff on the side, but we all devote most of our energy to The Simpsons.
So that being said, the Simpsons itself shows no signs of losing steam. And I think that you said to somebody in an interview once that its demise would probably depend more on the actors who have to portray the characters than on any other aspect.
I think that's true, and economics. I mean, and that might come from the actors and whatever salaries they get. The show is still successful. Internationally, it's incredibly successful. Obviously, it's a merchandising machine. I think it will just get to the point of dollars and cents. It seems to me, can we still make the show at a price that merits it being made? And whatever the factors are that go into that price will probably be the end. I hope that's I don't hope that. I hope that's the case more than just the show became horrible.
Yes.
You know what I mean? I would like it to end on a high note.
Yeah. Go like Ali and not.
Exactly.
Okay, then last question has to do with, and I have to ask this because we're in Canada.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of Canadian cracks on the show. My understanding is they don't come from you. Is that right?
Not as many as you would think. It's true. I mean, there have been a lot of cracks before. Any Canadians worked on the show, and there's two other Canadians other than myself, a guy Tim Long and a guy Jeff Westbrook. So we often find ourselves defending Canada or trying to correct the crack because the crack is quite off. But yeah, no surprise Americans like to make fun of Canada. I hope that's not going to be the lead story on the news tonight. No,
Colbert's already taken care of that.
Oh, good, exactly. Canada is a convenient punchline. What I always try to tell people is, yes, we do make fun of Canada 5% of the show, but the other 95% of the show is making fun of America. So it's by population number, we're still ahead by 5%.
Oh, there you go.
Okay.
Exactly. Good of you to do this, Joel. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks. Good to meet you.
You too.
Thanks.